There is one 20-mile wide strip of water on this planet that has the power to spike gas prices at your local pump, crash stock markets overnight, and drag multiple nuclear-capable militaries into direct confrontation. And it's been sitting at the center of the most dangerous standoff in the world for over a year now, without most people fully grasping what's actually at stake. I'm talking about the Strait of Hormuz. What's happening there right now isn't a footnote to the broader Iran conflict. It is the actual battlefield, the pressure point, the single choke point that determines whether this entire crisis stays contained or explodes into something the whole global economy feels within days. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why this narrow strip of ocean has become the most watched, most fought over waterway on Earth, who's actually losing sleep over it, and what the next move in this standoff is likely to be. The Strait of Hormuz connects the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and then out to the open ocean, sitting between Iran on one side and Oman and the United Arab Emirates on the other. At its narrowest point, it's only about 30 miles wide, and the actual shipping lanes ships can safely navigate are far narrower than that, just a couple of miles in each direction, split into inbound and outbound channels with a buffer zone in between them. Through that impossibly narrow gap passes roughly 1/5 of the entire world's oil supply every single day. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Qatar all depend on this passage to get their oil to global markets, and Iran itself relies on it for its own exports. There is no real alternative route that can absorb that volume.
The Strait of Hormuz connects the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and then out to the open ocean, sitting between Iran on one side and Oman and the United Arab Emirates on the other. At its narrowest point, it's only about 30 miles wide, and the actual shipping lanes ships can safely navigate are far narrower than that, just a couple of miles in each direction, split into inbound and outbound channels with a buffer zone in between them. Through that impossibly narrow gap passes roughly 1/5 of the entire world's oil supply every single day. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Qatar all depend on this passage to get their oil to global markets, and Iran itself relies on it for its own exports. There is no real alternative route that can absorb that volume. A handful of pipelines exist that can bypass the strait partially, running overland through Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but nowhere close to enough capacity to replace what moves through the water. When people say the global economy runs through this stretch of ocean, that's not an exaggeration. It's a literal description of how energy moves from the ground to your gas tank, to the plane you fly on, to the plastic in nearly everything you own, and to the electricity bill you pay every month. Now let's walk through exactly how this became the epicenter of the crisis, because the timeline here matters enormously for understanding what comes next. After the 12-day war between Israel and Iran in the summer of 2025 ended in a shaky ceasefire mediated by the United States and Qatar, tensions simmered but never actually disappeared. Iran fired missiles at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar during that conflict, a direct strike on American forces stationed in the region, though it caused no casualties. The ceasefire held, barely, despite both sides violating it within hours of it taking effect, with Trump publicly losing his temper on live television at both governments for failing to respect a deal they had just agreed to. Then came January of this year, when Iran's own government carried out a brutal crackdown on the largest domestic protest the country had seen since the 1979 revolution, massacring thousands of its own civilians in the process. That crackdown triggered the largest American military buildup in the region since the 2003 invasion of Iraq, with ships, aircraft, and additional troops flooding back into the Gulf in anticipation of renewed conflict. Then in February, everything exploded again. Israeli and American strikes killed Iran's supreme leader, along with a wave of senior officials in a single devastating operation, essentially decapitating Iran's top leadership structure overnight, destroying a massive number of military and government targets and killing civilians in the process. Instead of ending the conflict, that strike triggered a dramatic escalation. Iran's response wasn't just missiles and drones aimed at Israel and American bases scattered across the region. It was strategic, economic, and deliberately global in its impact. Iran effectively choked off the Strait of Hormuz, understanding perfectly well that disrupting oil flow through that passage would inflict pain on the entire global economy, not just its direct adversaries. Within weeks, fuel shortages hit parts of Asia, oil markets convulsed, and countries with absolutely nothing to do with the underlying dispute between Israel, the United States, and Iran suddenly found themselves paying the price through spiking energy costs at home. What followed was one of the longest and most tense standoffs over a single body of water in modern history. Trump set a string of deadlines demanding Iran fully reopen the strait, the 21st of March, then the 23rd, then the 7th of April, each one blown past without resolution. He threatened to destroy Iran's civilian energy infrastructure entirely if a deal wasn't reached, then extended that threat specifically to Karg Island, the terminal responsible for handling nearly all of Iran's oil exports, meaning the very economic lifeline Iran depends on just to keep functioning as a state. He even extended the threat to Iran's desalination plants, the facilities providing drinking water to millions of ordinary Iranian civilians who had absolutely nothing to do with any of the decisions being made by their government. On the morning of the final deadline, he posted publicly that a whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again. That's the level of rhetoric this standoff reached coming from the president of the most powerful military on earth. Hours after that post, a ceasefire was announced, brokered by Pakistan, reportedly following a last-minute push from China to get Iran's leadership to accept the terms. But here's the critical detail most people miss. That ceasefire didn't actually resolve the Hormuz situation. It just shifted the standoff into a slower, grinding phase of brinkmanship. Iran refused to fully reopen the strait, insisting that continued Israeli attacks on Lebanon and Hezbollah violated the spirit of the truce and gave it no reason to cooperate on shipping access. By mid-March, only 15 ships had managed to pass through the strait in an entire month, an almost complete collapse of one of the most critical shipping lanes on the planet. Insurance premiums for tankers attempting the passage soared to levels that made the voyage barely profitable for shipping companies, and several major carriers simply suspended their routes through the Gulf entirely rather than risk their vessels and crews. The United States responded to Iran's refusal by imposing a full naval blockade of Iranian ports, positioning warships to intercept vessels attempting to move oil in or out of the country. Iran declared that any military vessels entering the strait under those conditions will be treated as a direct ceasefire violation and responded accordingly. What resulted was an almost surreal situation, a dual blockade of the Persian Gulf, with the United States blocking Iranian shipping on one side and Iran effectively blocking general commercial shipping on the other, leaving the entire waterway functioning at a fraction of its normal capacity for weeks on end. Pakistan and China jointly proposed a 5-point peace initiative calling for an immediate end to hostilities and unrestricted humanitarian access. Iran countered with its own 5-point demand list, insisting on an end to U.S.-Israeli attacks on its allies in Lebanon and Iraq, binding security guarantees against future aggression, war reparations, and formal international recognition of Iranian sovereignty over the strait itself, a demand that alarmed nearly every other country bordering the Gulf, since none of them wanted Iran holding unilateral legal authority over a waterway they all depend on equally. The United States, through Pakistani intermediaries, delivered its own 15-point counterproposal demanding a complete end to Iran's nuclear program, strict limits on its missile arsenal, full and immediate reopening of Hormuz, restrictions on Iran's support for armed proxy groups throughout the region, and sanctions relief in exchange. Iran rejected it outright, with an anonymous official telling state media that Iran will end the war when it decides to, and when its own conditions are met, not on Washington's timeline and not under threat. During this same stretch, an Iran-flagged cargo ship called the Tosca attempted to breach the American naval blockade near the entrance to the strait. The USS Bruins, an American destroyer, warned the ship for 6 straight hours before finally opening fire with its deck gun, blowing a hole directly through the ship's engine room and disabling it completely before taking the vessel and its crew into custody. The ship was nearly 900 feet long, headed toward Bandar Abbas, one of Iran's most important ports. That single incident became a symbol of just how close this standoff had come to open naval warfare over commercial shipping rights. Eventually, after months of this grinding pressure, a more comprehensive 60-day ceasefire framework was agreed to in mid-June, and on the 17th of June, the presidents of the United States and Iran signed a formal memorandum of understanding to end the war, not in Washington, not in Tehran, but at the Palace of Versailles in France, immediately following a G7 summit, with the French president hosting the dinner at which it was signed. Pakistan confirmed publicly that the signing meant Iran would reopen Hormuz instantly and that the American blockade would end immediately. American Central Command confirmed the following day that the naval blockade had indeed been lifted. Ships began moving through the strait again for the first time in what felt like ages. But almost immediately, new reports surfaced of drone attacks on shipping inside the strait, with both sides publicly blaming each other for violating the newly signed terms. This is the single most important thing to understand about the entire Hormuz situation right now. This is not a resolved conflict. It is a conflict on pause, sustained by paperwork, exhaustion, and temporary economic necessity, rather than any genuine underlying resolution. Every single pause in this specific standoff has eventually cracked, some of them within days, none of them lasting more than a few months before some new incident, some new strike, some new violation drag the whole situation back toward crisis. The strait itself remains the pressure valve for the entire broader conflict. Whenever tensions between Israel and Iran spike anywhere else, whether it strikes on Hezbollah in Lebanon or covert operations inside Iranian territory, the first place the consequences show up is here, in delayed shipping, spiking insurance costs, and nervous energy markets bracing for the next disruption. Now let's talk about who actually gets hurt when the strait gets disrupted, because it's a far longer list than most people realize. China imports a massive share of its oil through this exact passage, making it acutely sensitive to any disruption despite having no direct role in the underlying conflict. India faces similar exposure, relying heavily on Gulf oil to power its rapidly growing economy. Japan and South Korea, both heavily dependent on imported energy with almost no domestic production of their own, watch every development in the strait with genuine alarm because a prolonged closure would hit their economies almost immediately. European countries, still recovering from earlier energy shocks tied to the war in Ukraine, have even less tolerance for another major disruption to global energy supply. And crucially, the Gulf states themselves, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and Kuwait, all of whom have carefully tried to stay out of direct involvement in the Iran conflict, find themselves financially exposed every single time shipping through the strait slows down, since their entire economic models depend on reliably exporting oil through this one narrow gap. This is exactly why you've seen so many countries pushing so hard for de-escalation, even ones with no formal stake in the Israel-Iran-US conflict itself. China's role in nudging Iran's leadership toward accepting the April ceasefire wasn't humanitarian generosity. It was direct economic self-interest, protecting its own energy supply chain from a disruption it could not control and did not want. Pakistan's repeated role as mediator throughout this entire timeline reflects similar motivations. A regional interest in stability that has nothing to do with taking sides in the underlying dispute, and everything to do with keeping trade routes open. So what actually happens next with the Strait of Hormuz? Let's walk through the realistic scenarios, because there are really only a few paths this can take from here. The first and most likely scenario in the near term is continued fragile stability, punctuated by periodic incidents, drone strikes on individual ships, brief interruptions to shipping, temporary spikes in insurance costs, without a full-scale closure of the strait. This is essentially the pattern we've already seen repeat multiple times, and given how exhausted all sides appear to be after more than a year of direct and indirect conflict, it remains the most probable path for at least the next several months. The second scenario, and the one worth watching most closely, is a renewed and more prolonged closure triggered by escalation somewhere else in the broader conflict, most likely tied to Lebanon and Hezbollah, since that's proven to be the single most consistent trigger for Iran choking off the strait throughout this entire timeline. If Israel launches another major operation against Hezbollah, expect Iran to respond by restricting shipping again almost immediately, regardless of whatever ceasefire language technically remains in effect with the United States. The third and most dangerous scenario is a genuine military confrontation directly inside the strait itself, ship to ship, potentially involving not just American and Iranian vessels, but also Gulf state navies caught in the crossfire. The Tuska incident showed just how close this came to happening, even during a period when both sides were technically negotiating peace. A single miscalculation, one warning shot ignored, one drone strike misidentified, could trigger exactly this kind of confrontation with almost no warning at all. And the fourth scenario, the one diplomats and economists everywhere are quietly hoping for, is some kind of durable long-term arrangement that genuinely internationalizes protection of the strait, potentially involving multiple countries, jointly guaranteeing safe passage regardless of the state of relations between Iran, Israel, and the United States specifically. Iran's own outreach to China, Pakistan, Turkey, and Russia for security guarantees hints at this kind of arrangement, though any solution along these lines would require concessions from virtually every major power involved, something that is proven extremely difficult to achieve even once throughout this entire drawn-out crisis. Here's the bottom line. The Strait of Hormuz isn't just a side story in the broader Iran conflict. It is quite possibly the most important single indicator for tracking where this entire situation is headed, because it's the one place where military conflict, economic pressure, and global energy security collide directly and immediately. Every time you see a headline about oil prices spiking without an obvious domestic cause, check what's happening in the Gulf first. Every time shipping insurance rates jump unexpectedly, check the strait. This narrow stretch of water has become the pulse of the entire conflict, and right now, that pulse is anything but steady. Keep watching it closely, because the next major disruption there won't just be a regional headline, it'll hit your wallet within days, no matter where in the world you're watching this from.